Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new double album from Between the Buried and Me, Automata 1 and 2. So I've made it no secret that I don't tend to be a huge fan of death metal, especially once we start getting to the more technical, punishing territory, but I've always had one big asterisk in that category, and that was for Between the Buried and Me. As I said before, I got into this band in university, and while the wild tonal shifts and overall presentation took a long time to really grow on me, I still stand up for Colors and Alaska to this day. They're genuinely fantastic records, even revisiting them now. And yet, in a bizarre parallel to Opeth, as Between the Buried and Me shelves more of their heavier side for more prog rock and prog metal tendencies, I paradoxically tended to like them a lot less, as those shifts seem to have come at the cost of smart mix balance, intensity, and the addition of synthesizer tones I don't think anybody wanted. And I can't tell you how aggressively irritating that is for me, because it's clear that Between the Buried and Me is trying to get more experimental and incorporating a richer cross-section of sounds and progressions into their music, but more often than not, those sounds wind up not really complementing the compositions nearly as well as they should. And I'll say it right here, I was probably too nice to their 2015 record Coma Ecliptic when I reviewed it formally on this channel, because while it is not a bad album, it is absolutely a measurable step from the band at their best, and really has not been anything I've wanted to revisit since. I mean, it's decent, but it is far, far away from great. And I'll be blunt with you here again and say I had some big concerns going into this project too. A double album, the first half released in early March of this year, with the second half only coming out now, and while I have never liked it when bands pull this release strategy for double albums, it did give me some forewarning that Automata might be a bit of a mess, especially for Automata 1, some of the reviews I saw, especially with some of the wilder rumors I'd heard about the second half too. But hey, maybe Coma Ecliptic was transitional, and they'd actually managed to stick the landing with both parts here. Right? Well, I will be blunt. I have given this project a solid 6 to 8 listens to really wrap my head around the ideas that it's trying to put forward, followed up with me actually doing my research into the concept that frontman Tommy Rogers is looking to express in the content. No Deaf Heaven retraction here, I wanted to make sure I got this right the first time, and on some level, I actually like the ideas that Between the Buried and Me wanted to explore on Automata, and yet I'm not really a fan of what they brought together here in the execution, some of which has carried over from Coma Ecliptic, although I'd like to think that I like this just a little bit more, and some of which just feels like a brand of progressive metal experimentation that just does not resonate as strongly as I was hoping on this album as a whole. So yeah, it's good, I can kind of recommend it, but I won't call this great or anything close to their best. So let's start with that, shall we? Now for starters, I strongly recommend you listen to both records here together as one piece, and not split apart. Mostly because Automata 1 doesn't really have a satisfying ending, it's really kind of abrupt there, and you really need the second piece to make any sort of solid sense of the narrative. Already a little bit jumbled together because of a scrambled timeline, only revealed if you look into the liner notes, which is not a good sign for the record. And this is one of those cases where I'm not sure why this is a double album at all. Sure, there might be a natural stopping point in the lyrics, which I will discuss a little bit more, but in execution, it leaves us with songs that could have easily had some fat trim to pull this comfortably under an hour, and probably should have had that done if listening to both discs together. And while Between the Buried and Me, it's always had a wonky relationship with any sort of pacing on their albums, the more they double down on pieces comfortably around the 8-minute mark and sometimes over the 10-minute mark, split more by abortive interludes that barely rise above 2 minutes, leave me thinking that the structure could have used another run on the drawing board. And on that topic, well, longtime fans will be really familiar with the band's style, and I include myself in that. The off-kilter guitar patterns, the shifting time signatures, the arpeggiated melodic riffs, the wild drum work. It's also hard not to feel like the group is increasingly losing sight of their strengths and of their heaviness. A big part of this comes in leftover issues from Coma Ecliptic, which were not resolved here. Inconsistent bass lines when they don't have to anchor a passage, which means the mix winds up being top-heavy, the cymbals that are slathered over the larger mix, which sometimes even drown out the rhythm guitar, and synth choices that do little to anything to flatter the overall track. The absolute worst case is on House Organ, with all of its programmed fizzy popping and weedy guitars when you already have a drum line. But in truth, the only place where I found the synth that worked at all was on the bassy, pulsating groove on Blot. Yeah, they tried to make it work on the grid, but that song really would have been better if it was just focusing on those dreamy electric guitar passages instead of those low-end synths that neither complement the bass or add a lot of tempo or texture. They just don't really work on an otherwise pretty good song. But really, texture is the key word here. Mostly because for the majority of this album, There isn't any. I have no idea why Between the Buried and Me have continued to blast away any low-end thickness or grit with every single album they put out in more of a prog metal vein, but it started getting aggressively grating when the passages with more texture, like the drums and the pluckier guitars that actually pick up some more crunch on Blot, or the chugging main melody on the Proverbial Bellow that I really liked, they became the exception rather than the norm. And then we got Tommy Rogers' vocals. Look, he's got a solid growl, and his clean singing did grow on me a little bit throughout this double album when he was given a little bit more reverb and spatial effects around it, but in some songs he tries to move into a more nasal cackle off his clean singing, like on Voice of Trespass and Yellow Eyes, and it's just jarring when overlaid with the far more convincing dirty vocals. And on the topic of Voice of Trespass, a really controversial song, look, like everybody, I was kind of thrown for a loop when after an accordion-driven interlude, we're thrown into a swing metal number, but Between the Buried and Me has always pivoted into weird experimental directions without warning, look at colors. But what bothered me is that it basically sounded like a Diablo Swing orchestra cut from 12 years ago, and didn't feel nearly as experimental or unique as it should. We'll come back to this when we talk about the lyrics, but at least that cut did have some low-end groove and more of a persistent melody that stuck in my head, if not a lot of a stable hook, which might as well be my biggest criticism of this double album as a whole. I'm sorry, I'm gonna say it. If you're gonna clean up the production this much to approach Steven Wilson levels, you should bring the chorus hooks to match beyond just some interesting melodic passages. Otherwise, the songs can feel really meandering and scattered, especially given how long so many of them run. And that's really frustrating that songs like Millions and The Grid and Blot, they get really close to that, but they just never fully stick the landing, and that bugged me. Now, granted, some of that scattered feeling, it's likely part of the point, which takes us to the lyrics and themes, which take the concept of an artist becoming trapped in their own dreams projected by a nefarious company for the entertainment of the masses. And if you're thinking that this can be both kind of self-referential and a little bit up its own ass, you'd be right. But there is some nuance here if you're paying attention that I did respect and appreciate. I like how so much of the writing on the first Automata is kind of scattered and dreamlike. It fit the composition, always hemmed in by electricity metaphors and the feral thoughts that haunt one's subconscious. And I like how Millions steps back to highlight how isolating that larger fame could be in more of a flashback scene, placing the artist in a vulnerable position of self-doubt and loneliness to be exploited by that larger corporation. And Blot, it works as the sharp point of realization of what could be risked by doing this. It becomes clear that the artist is making the choice to expose this and his own myopia. You actually take a step into that own dream reality. He's doing it of his own free will, and it's that blot in his eye, and it makes it clear that he's not quite prepared for the greater dangers of what his subconscious could unearth when he goes into that dream and then forgets it was really just a dream. The larger industry doesn't really care all that much ultimately in the end. Voice of Trespass highlights their internal hollowness that they're desperate to fill, but the craven greed is pretty naked across the album. And incidentally, this is where I find the choice to go for the sweaty, vaudeville swing metal route to be a little bit too on the nose when it comes to music as coding. But really, the larger truth is that the artists, they were just searching for larger companionship. They didn't want to feel alone. And once he's conscious of that dream's projection and his place within it, there's almost an uneasy truce forged on the grid. And despite how unbelievably meta it feels, with the dreams manufactured for wider immersion on another on-the-nose metaphor for music and art, and you could tell that Tommy Rogers primarily wrote this on tour, oh my god, it's obvious. But I do like the artist realizing his feedback loop with the Millions looking on that can provide a strange vestige of peace and contentment, and he needs some structure to get it out of the masses, so the industry has a part. To quote, "Judge not what we do, judge what we feed," as every part needs the other, and after all, everyone's in it together. But as a whole, alright, look, for me, Between the Buried and Me, they're settling into a niche sound and style and progressive metal that's just not really my thing consistently, especially with this production, and it's a pretty far step away from records like Alaska and Colors that I like a lot more. Now that said, there's still a thematic consistency that I like, and I can't really deny the group can still play like hell and turn out a lot of catchy as hell melodies pretty damn consistently. But on the other hand, if there's a record where the group really needs to take a step back and reconsider how they would structure an album, let alone a double album, it is this one. So with all that, extremely light 7 out of 10. Really just for a different set of fans than me at this point, and I can respect that. Check it out if you're up for an odd and really interesting listen, or if you already heard Automata 1 and you're curious about Automata 2, because I'd argue it's a little better. But Between the Buried and Me might want to get their heads out of their asses for a little bit. Metatext can only carry you so long. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I remember the last time I covered Between the Buried and Me, and it got a pretty sizable backlash of people just annoyed with me. Look, folks, I wanted to like this, and I think it's better than Coma Ecliptic, so take that as you will. Just be civil in the comments. And if you want to buy the record, links down there below, and the poll's all there for you diehard fans. Tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there, and if you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.